Hi, this is Paul, and if you've been following my conversations, you know that Saturday and Sunday night were the big events with Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris. And some people wrote me and said, "Do you have a recording of it?" No, I don't. I don't live in Vancouver. I wasn't there. I don't have a recording. I've read a few Reddit posts about it. Some friends have forwarded me some takes on it. There's some stuff on Facebook on it. I do have a friend who went and he shared some thoughts with me, and he was pleased by it. He thought that it wasn't that I wouldn't be surprised given the comments that I've made about the event in terms of what happened. Jordan Peterson tweeted out that it will be eventually released, and most reports are that people are pleased, but it went as expected. And so this was rummaging around in my head, and as you know, last week I was struggling to get out a video on this word religion, how it's clearly a trigger for the likes of Sam Harris and Matt Dillahunty and this community. And I can understand why it's a trigger. It's been associated with some very large, long-lived power structures that have dominated Western civilization. The Roman Catholic Church is a very old, very powerful institution and has been for a long time. It probably hasn't been as in the 20th century. It dramatically lost a lot of power in a number of places in the world. But that doesn't mean it isn't still formidable in many ways. Now, I'm a Protestant, so Protestants know a little something about the power of the Roman Catholic Church, because Protestants have been fragmented and we're all in these tiny little denominations. I'm in the Christian Reformed Church, which is about 250,000 people. Way back in the 1990s, they would hope, or in the 1980s, they thought they'd grow to 400,000 by 2000. And now we're struggling to keep 250,000 by 2020. So the church has obviously been a dominant, powerful institution in the West, and Christianity certainly has. And of course, Peterson has spoken on this quite extensively with respect to Nietzsche. Its overthrow in the West has been the focus of the last 200 years, really. And one of the things we should pay attention to are time frames, because length is important here. Now, Sam Harris's definition of religion tends to include a number of things. He's got problems with stories as being authoritative in our culture and in our behavior. And he'd like things to be fact and reason based. He's got a problem with supernatural content. I still haven't done a video on natural versus supernatural, because I think that this is an area that could be looked at with quite a bit of benefit when we think about, if I would just ask you, what would something have to be for you to consider it supernatural? That conversation gets interesting pretty quickly. Now, implicit in a lot of this is authoritative and sometimes authoritarian. Sam Harris's complaint is that religion tends to lead to ignorance, to suffering, and to immorality. Dogma is a big word for Sam Harris. Dogma, and what he means by dogma, are things that are supposed to be permanent and not allowed to change. Now, this is, I'm always chagrined at these definitions, because then you've just created a new dogma. This is just the way language and people work. We have fixed points and we have flexible points, and we go back and forth. We might call this the triumph of the secular frame, or think about Charles Taylor's book, A Secular Age, where he maps the last 500 years. And so in some ways, this is the triumph of the seculars. And we've had a series of large and small social and political experiments going on in the West. And I want to pluck out the Oneida community. I read a book a few years ago on it. Fascinating study, and a book that sheds a lot of light onto far larger communities in the 19th and 20th century. Communism, which was more successful than Nazism. Science-based progressivism, that's currently the dominant paradigm in the West. Now all of this is wanting to make life better. I mean, very few people are saying, I'm going to go out there and I want to make life worse for everyone. Usually it's, I want to make life better for me and those I care about, and if other people, it makes their life worse, well, I'll worry about that second. So most of these initiatives and experiments have been trying to make life better. And equality is a common goal in this. And if you watch, just this morning I watched Jordan Peterson's conversation in the Oxford, I forget what it is, the Oxford Commons or something like that. A good conversation. I thought Peterson did well. I just got a text from my wife. I thought Peterson did well. I thought his answers were clear, and I think he's continuing to make progress in articulating his position succinctly and contextually. So that was, I thought, a good video to watch. Now let's talk a little bit about the Oneida community. It's well known for being utopian, for being liberal when it came to sex, and it was a very industrious community. It thrived. It was communitarian. It was a communal living. It was a religious community, but the religious aspect was very much a hybrid of, typical 19th century, late 19th century, a lot of optimism about religion and science working together to yield a great new utopia. Had amazing equality of the sexes. Women, the gender roles weren't terribly fixed. It was science-based. It had what they considered to be a highly evolved religion according to the standards of its day. It was enormously prosperous, and sexual satisfaction was a high priority by all members. And this book that I've got on the screen, Oneida by Helen Wayland Smith, who herself is a descendant of that community, was just a fun, insightful, profitable book to read, not just if you're historically curious about this strange group of people. The subtitle of the book is From Free Love Utopia to a Well-Set Table, because one of the interesting things about the community is that over time they had to morph and change themselves into different, with different values to match the different times. And so it's a very interesting study on the late 19th and then into the 20th century, into the Cold War period. The community at its notable height was at that point under really a religious authoritarian rule. It was a dictatorship by one of the religious / scientific gurus who basically had unquestioned authority and tried to govern the community that well. And they were, again, for a period of time, very happy and very prosperous. Individual liberty was tempered by communal needs. One of the interesting aspects about the community was that they very much guarded against sticky relationships, as they called them. They didn't want people pairing off one to another and they practiced, basically in the late 19th century, they practiced the withdrawal method to keep the women from having children. They didn't have terribly reliable birth control. And so actually what wound up happening was a sort of a late 19th century upstate New York utopian brave new world. First, the control of sticky relationships also became an interesting eugenics project, because the leader of the community was trying to breed the great new humanity that would continue to follow their teachings and would someday overtake the world. Difficulties it had is it couldn't insulate itself from the broader pressures, both social and economic, and those kinds of pressures eventually made the Oneida community change. Now, if we contrast, let's say, the Oneida community with communism, some interesting things emerge. Communism seemed relatively successful, and by that, I know, just hold on. By that I mean for a number of decades, millions of people around the world saw it as hope for an alternative to capitalism. Some of the hard edges of capitalism were were being felt by people, and so communism was seen, quite possibly as a fairer alternative. And I think a lot of people today, that glow of communism endures, and we hear it in society today. If you ask many people, especially on the left, about communism, they'll say, "Oh, but what happened in Russia and China and Cambodia and Cuba, that wasn't what could be. We could do it better than them." Despite the fact that millions of dead, many still want to adapt and try forms of it. It's still a living conversation in our midst. And it's important to note that it wasn't defeated as much as simply found unsustainable. It collapsed from within, and it succumbed to corruption. I'm old enough to remember the fall of the communist world, and I'm about Jordan Peterson's age. The fall of the communist world and what it was like living during the 70s and 80s in the Cold War. And I remember as a schoolboy, we'd have these big debates over who was the bigger army, the United States or Russia, and who would win in a war. And the truth was, everyone would lose in a war. And so then when it was a variety of things brought the fall of the Soviet Union, pressure from Ronald Reagan with, the arms race, upping the arms race, continued strength of the coalition of NATO to keep communism from spreading, even the Korean and the Vietnam War, both which were by no means successful by the West. So communism was more or less contained and left to collapse of its own corruptions. Now, obviously, the Soviet Union fell. Communism in China remains a communist country, but they clearly changed their brand of communism to a rampant form of capitalism underneath it, which again begs the question as to what degree was communism an overlay over other layers of Chinese society. I'm not an expert in Chinese culture by any means, so I won't speculate. But communism, again, here we had a late 19th, early 20th century utopian version of how to organize human beings, and it failed. And one of the lessons from this is that time tells. The united community in its radical form didn't last long at all. It eventually changed and became quite a successful capitalist corporation from which you might have silverware. Communism grew far larger and lasted somewhat longer in its idealistic forms, but elements were clearly at odds with some basic facts about human nature, and it showed that cruel aggregates, which I would call markets, were in many ways smarter than reason. Again, the idea of central planning was that smart people, the elites, were going to sit down and have all the information, be able to plan out the society. And we should remember that in the 20th century, this was very much tried in the United States in the middle part of the century. The way to get out of the recession was, well, we're going to work our economics, we have the science, and we're going to get out of it this way. Well, it kind of took a Second World War to break it. And this, in a sense, affirms some of Scheidel's observations that, what levels inequality? Well, disasters, war, plagues, all these kinds of horrible things. Well, it made the United States the top dog in the world in many ways. Now, Peterson, again, in the Oxford video that just came out, loves to talk about the rise of the individual, and in that video he talks about the sovereign individual instead of the sacred individual or the divine individual, and this is what's celebrated in the West. And we could add quite a bit of nuance to this when Peterson brings this up in his complaints about collectivistic tendencies of the contemporary left, especially in the university. This is the context in which he's bringing up individualism. Jordan Peterson sees some of the dynamics in the rise of Christianity in the West, but Christianity has within it a lot of subtle interchange between individual and group. Jesus, of course, is a single man who dies for the rest of the world. Arguably the most famous verse in the New Testament, John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his son for the world. And so you've got individual and group, and they tend to go back and forth. And so in the West, you've both got this determined humanism, which springs out of the Judeo-Christian imago Dei, and that's in tension, in a sense, with the expressive individualism that Robert Bellah, I mentioned his important book before, that Robert Bellah, a sociologist that towards the end of the 20th century, brought up. Individuals, however, have a perspectival challenge. Now we're going to get into more Sam Harris consciousness stuff. See, consciousness can become the tyranny of the moment, and I always kind of chuckle when people are like, live in the moment. I'll say, yeah, I see a lot of people who live in the moment. I know a lot of drug addicts who live in the moment. I know a lot of homeless people who live in the moment. On one hand, we say live in the moment, but save for the future, and save for eat right and exercise. Well, you know, if you're living in the moment, you're not really eating right and exercising. These are kind of two parts of the mind that are working together. We say live in the moment, but eat right and exercise. Because obviously the height of living in the moment is short, happy, cocaine, dead. We are short-lived creatures, and this makes our rationalist capacity, this compromises that ability. And so we're always working on the moment and the lifetime. Well, what is an individual? Well, for quite a few years now, I've done a lot of thinking about this. In many ways, yourself, the thing that you call you, the thing I call me, it isn't so much this body. I've changed dramatically in the last 20 years. I used to have a full head of dark hair, and I could eat anything I wanted to and didn't gain much weight. And you know, now I'm in my 50s, so I have to go to the gym just to maintain, and my hair flew the coop, and you know, here I am. Well, what is me? Is it this body? Is it this thing? And I think the best argument in terms of the best image of what we are is, in a sense, a story. The cells of my body change, the circumstances of my life changes, my ideas change, my interests change, and I'm in my 50s now, and I think I know more than I knew when I was in my 40s, and I thought then I knew more than I knew when I was in my 30s, and so on and so forth. And so we're a remarkably difficult moving target to try to figure out. And so in some ways, one of the best ways to conceive of ourselves is in fact a story. We are clearly not simply our physical bodies. Cells change. We're highly programmable. We're deeply influenced by whatever's in our environment. You know, I've been looking at Jordan Peterson for a year now. I've been deeply influenced by Jordan Peterson. 10 years ago, I was spending a lot of time listening to Tim Keller. I was deeply influenced by Tim Keller. The decade before, I was deeply influenced by someone else, and before that, and of course, when I was just a kid growing up, I was deeply influenced by my parents first, and then my peers. You know, what is me? And almost the best way to figure out what I am is that I am a story. Now, is that story material? Now, obviously, that story has material manifestations, and that story is colonizing material and changing the material world, but am I fundamentally material? When people are unable to maintain a cohesive story, we call it an illness. I know a number of schizophrenics, and they have a terrible time with that. Many of us know people who've had dramatic transformations in the course of their lifetime. And, you know, I'm not saying this is a bad thing or a good thing. There's a famous story about Augustine. He obviously had a pretty dramatic religious conversion. In his younger life, he was sexually a pretty active young man. And he met one of his lovers, and she came up to him, and he completely ignored her. And she said to him, "Augustine, it is I." And he said, "Yes, but it is not I." In other words, Augustine considered himself a new creation. This is deep into Christian theology and Christian ideas about what and who we are, because these stories impact one another and these stories change one another. We've got this moment-by-moment consciousness. It requires a story, I think, in fact, to experience meaning. We've seen movies and read stories and heard accounts of, for example, people who can't form new short-term memories. And we look at these people and we pity them. Why? Well, they can't do all of the things that we consider meaningful. They can't form long-term, fulfilling relationships. So we have moment and we have memory, and so moment and memory together create story, because again, as we know about memory, we think that we are just remembering. In a sense, we think that we are remembering the world the way it sometimes seems Sam Harris wants to say we are experiencing the world, but we know that our memories aren't anywhere near that objective. In fact, I, like many people, when my children were young, we made a lot of videotape of those kids, and we lived a long ways from my wife's parents and from my parents, so we've got all that videotape. And sometimes it's fun to pull out and watch. Sometimes it's painful to pull out and watch, because I have to see myself through my 50-year-old eyes looking at my 20-something or 30-something or 40-something self, and now I know some of what that self back then didn't know, and I lament some of the decisions that self made. And, well, how am I to think about this experience of looking back on myself and critiquing who I was? And this is an enormously complicated thing. So, again, we have the question, well, what am I? Well, I'm a story, but I'm a really interesting kind of story. I'm not like a story that's been written down in a book like a novel. It's a story that keeps changing. And this gets interesting in terms of Christianity and ideas of what Christians usually term salvation, because what finally does God save? It's also very interesting in terms of some Eastern religions where they talk about reincarnation, because what actually gets recycled. So in Christianity we have this theology that says, well, first of all, we anticipate a resurrection, that I'll be given a new body. And as Paul says, it's a spiritual body. That doesn't mean immaterial. It means that it is a body that is deriving its life more faithfully from the Spirit of God than my rebellious self is doing now. So this business about what I am, what is an individual, is by no means a simple, easy thing. Now, when we look at humanity, and when we look at the technological progress that allows me to sit in here and talk at this computer, and this will get uploaded to Google servers, and I will colonize all your brains as I do this. Someone said I should do my Scott Adams. I should memify my Scott Adams hypnosis thing, because I'm influencing you, and you're inviting my influence if you're listening to me. Now, maybe you're inviting it to reject it or argue against me, or maybe you're finding parts of it useful, and so on and so forth. Our success as a species, however, is that we've been able to construct civilizations. Now, we might ask, well, what is a civilization? These are extended multi-layer stories that allow us to transcend our short little lives. And if you read the Bible, you very quickly get the sense, especially in the Old Testament, the worst thing that can happen to a person is that they will be cut off, that they will have no descendants. For example, when Babylon invades Judea and brings the king to Babylon, he first kills the king's sons in front of him and then plucks out his eyes. Why? That is about the worst thing you can imagine doing to someone in that culture. Hannah, at the beginning of the book of Samuel, is just beside herself because she's in a polygamous marriage, and Peninnah has many sons, and Hannah has offered her husband no son, but Elkanah loves Hannah the most, and Elkanah basically says, is not my love worth more than 7 sons? And she says, no, it isn't. And people read the Bible and say, oh, the Bible doesn't respect women. There's no strong women in the Bible. And I think you don't know your Bible at all. Hannah in that moment completely rejects the love of her husband and says, I need to produce sons. But then she goes on, and God blesses her with a son. And what does she do with that son? But she gives him up back to God, not in human sacrifice, of course, but Samuel then becomes a servant of the Lord, first via the tabernacle at Shiloh, and then as, in many ways, the last judge. And so civilization are these multi-layered stories that are so multi-dimensional, but yet over time develop into language and words and memes and monuments and statues and typical stories that mold us and shape us and create who we are. There's always weather and there's climate, and so what's happening in the moment is like the weather, but what happens in climate is like the culture and the civilization, and we both contribute to this and receive it. And it's this constant cycle of these large stories just accumulating and growing, and there's economies and forces and all kinds of things going on in this context. And that's really what civilizations are. If you listen to Yuval Harari, he makes the point that the main adaptation that we have that allowed us to transcend, I would say, colonize genetics is in fact our capacity for story. Now this is really interesting because, Sam Harris, I'll hear him say things like, well, story is nice, story is profitable, story can be useful, but fundamentally it's about facts and data. And I think story eats facts and data all the time. It's Peterson, it's our hierarchies. Why do we listen to Sam Harris on facts and data? It's because of where he is in the hierarchy, where he's come into the culture, where he's come into the story. And I'm looking forward to listening to this conversation to see if Peterson was able to push him on this a little bit, because when I listen to Harris, I think I don't know. I don't know if you're taking seriously enough the way that story and data work together. Now, someone sent me a very interesting video. I didn't even know Brett had his own channel, so I subscribed to his channel. I'm probably going to listen to some more of his videos. But he has this very interesting video on marriage as an evolutionary phenomenon. And so here is Brett talking about, all of the ins and outs of, he's a biologist, of course. And so that's the focus. And as I listened to him, I was thinking of all the ways that Peterson would say, yeah, but the selectivity and the hierarchies, let's imagine you strip Donald Trump of money, which is a fiction, of anything that any story might afford Donald Trump, and reduce him to a 70-something-year-old man. You'll have to strip him naked, and because clothing communicates culture, and you strip him naked, and, well, we can't have him eat Kentucky Fried Chicken because there's too much culture in that. But anyway, you get my point. Would he be able to be president of the United States? Would he be able to be a third-time married, often, straying husband? Would he be able to, again, he has no money. Money is story. That's what money is. Money is this contract that goes from one generation to the next. It's this ongoing story, and you can see this criticized if you watch something like The Walking Dead, where the money story breaks down and gold isn't worth much. What's worth a lot? Food and guns. And you don't have to be an expert in anthropology to recognize this story and understand why things slide the way they slide. But now here's Brett talking about a very interesting video on marriage and a number of things. But, basically it's the software, stupid.
And what this really suggests is that, yes, pair bonding is valuable in many circumstances, and the universe keeps telling us that by producing it in different taxa that aren't related to each other.
Even just notice how often story comes into how we talk about science. The universe tells us. Well, if that's not metaphorical, I don't know what is.
And marriage is this elaboration of these pair bonds in the context of a creature that picks up most of what it is behaviorally as a software update after it's born. And so the idea of parents who have this repository of humanness that they carry around in their minds rather than their genomes, and then they pass on to offspring in a way that can be augmented and modified for changes in circumstance or new discoveries, that is an amazingly powerful phenomenon. And it is not in any way incidental. Human beings are all about the software. Monogamous pair bonds that raise offspring are all about transmitting that software to the next generation, and two parents raising children together is the ideal way for that to work.
Yeah. He doesn't get into some of the more controversial aspects of a statement like that, but this is who we are, and it's all together. You cannot have a human child being raised not human. I mean, we without our touch, they fall apart. They need our stories. They need what comes from parents. Children need parents. Without a civilization, without a story, civilizations crumble. This news hour, I like to watch Shields and Brooks and listen to their commentary. Brooks was making the point that part of what's happening in our culture is we had a dominant story in the culture, and now we have a different story in the culture, or we're in between stories. And so all of this chaos that's currently happening in our culture now is because we're in a sense we're dealing with the handoff of stories, and the handoff isn't going well. And what does that mean? Now, according to Harris here, we're supposed to navigate by reason. Part of my skepticism with this is that right and wrong, and Jonathan Haidt demonstrates this over and over again, right and wrong are far more intuitive than rational. That rider on the elephant is very post hoc. And if you talk to people, they'll very quickly say, well, it just feels right, and it feels wrong. And if you look at the work of Christian Smith and his soul searching in his books, where he was interviewing hundreds and hundreds of teenagers to find out their religious, their moral, their ideas, this is the kind of thing that he noted. It's interesting also that when I talk to people more on the Sam Harris side of things, consciousness and the time problem. Well, we've got moment by moment. Consistency is very hard for us as human beings because we do live in the moment. So we're dependent on memory. So we've got this interchange continually going back between moment and memory and moment and memory. And it feels like reason will guide us, but memory is dicey. And even the way we talk about it feels like reason will guide us. Well, how do we know reason will guide us? And again, Scott Adams wants to talk about predictability, but that post hoc rider, predictability in how many things and how close. Now, if you have a fairly binary, who's going to win the election, Trump or or Clinton, well, you got a 50-50 shot at it. But, predicting other things is notoriously difficult. Predicting meaningful things is notoriously difficult for us. That'll give you an idea of just how chaotic this world is. So individual rationalizations accumulate in stories, and the story feeds back into memory and reason. And then again, this is part of what they have looked at in terms of memory and how memories form. The more times we revisit a memory, the more re-editing we do in that memory. And in what ways are we redoing that memory? Well, we are usually redoing that memory along the lines of the narrative or the story that we would like to believe of ourselves. And so this is part of the reason human beings are not very good at being objective. We're not very good at relaying history, but we're the best we've got, and we're the audience for what we've got. And so then when it comes to one of the things that I hear often when I listen to like Sam Harris, or Brett Weinstein for that matter, listen how many times they say better or worse. And the difficulty you have is better or worse on what standard? So there was a very interesting article that was in The Guardian about too smart, too successful Mongolia's superwomen struggle to find husbands. And so you had a whole bunch of NGOs after the collapse of communism in Mongolia. You had a whole bunch of NGOs that were very concerned about the education of women. And so there are a number of women who are very well educated, and what they discover is that, well, there aren't suitable mates. Well, why aren't there suitable mates? How do women choose suitable mates? They want suitable mates chosen for their world. And we find this again and again in the stories that we have. We're going to improve something, so we weigh in with our rationality because we think we have a pretty clear idea of that which is better and that which is worse. And so then we wade in and start tinkering, and what we discover is that, well, there's all kinds of consequences I didn't understand. And again, in Peterson's Oxford interview that he just did, he made the point that if things are 85% optimal, let's say, to get it 5% better is very, very difficult, but it's very easy to get it worse. And so part of what we have going on right now in our society is that there is so much technological disruption. There are so many new things for us in our history on this planet. Population is large, technology is new, the pill, we have no idea how that's going to change things. So you've got situations like you have here in Mongolia where these women can't find husbands. Well, what about Japan, where they're not getting married and the government is panicking? Why can't we do what humanity has always done in terms of let's have pair bonding and let's have them produce children and let's put them forward? Not too long ago, they tried the kibbutz system in Israel and having children raised in communes. And again, I started out talking about the Oneida community, where they were practicing, where they were trying to genetically engineer by the leader of the community. They were doing eugenics to try and create the best human beings they could. This is the kind of stuff we do. And the truth is, we monkey around in things that we don't really know what we're doing, but we think we know that what we're doing until we discover, well, we've done something that we didn't anticipate. I also this week read a very interesting article in The Atlantic on the Mars simulation, and there's a very interesting story about how hard should it be for 4 people to live a semi-isolated life in the hills over Hawaii. Well, it's hard if they don't want to break the script, or they don't want to break the fantasy of that they're on Mars, which is what the whole experiment is about. And this article talks about just how hard it is. There's so much we're dependent on that we are simply not conscious of. There's so much we assume that we simply are not aware of. One of the easiest ways to figure this out is to do your own simulation. Why don't you pick up stakes and move to another city, or better yet, to another country where your language, the language that you grew up on, isn't spoken, and just begin to learn what it means to be an alien, what it means to not know anything, and just see how much we simply assume within our own cultural bubbles. And now again, where are we going with this? Well, we have the question of story or facts, okay? Simplistic dualism. Well, story is just through, all the way down to the bottom, usually in ways we are simply not conscious of. To live as a human being in this world is to be a participant in normal genocide. Now, what do I mean by normal genocide? All of us die, 100%. By the age of 100 years from now, I'll most certainly be dead, and probably everyone listening to this video. Will this video be available 100 years from now? We have no idea. Every generation dies, taking with it what it learned. When you think about the cost of this, I mean, we pause when a celebrity dies and we think we will no longer have the fruit of what this person had contributed to our culture, whether it be writing or music or stagecraft or whatever. We will no longer have their experience, and we recognize this in a family. When my father died 5 years ago and my aunt died a number of months ago, we realized how much of the family story is just lost. Now I talked about this a little bit in my Sunday school class I did Sunday on 2 John, on the salutation to 2 John. And you might say, well, how could you spend an hour on just 2 John 3? Well, if you look at all these words that are in there, they're huge words. But we talked about the fact that, well, all of this knowledge that my father and my aunt took with them. Now, most of you might say, well, that's not important knowledge, because that's knowledge specific to my family, to my heritage, to our history, but it is knowledge that is gone, because without those people that were remembering it, the number of sources, written sources, that are available for just ordinary people like my grandparents and my great-grandparents, and the stories that were handed down, stuff is just gone. It's this genocide that happens every day in our world. We always have a transmission problem, partly because of interest. So maybe my father or my aunt were interested in some things, but not in other things. The things they were not interested in, gone. And so again, if you think about reality as, this near infinite accumulation of facts within which I sit, I even take in just this tiny little portion of it. And now we're going to talk about right and wrong. And the problems just get a whole lot worse. And what we can't escape, it seems, when we talk about right and wrong, is this monarchical vision that, well, this is right and this is wrong. And now we try and nuance, well, it's right in this situation and wrong in this situation. But if you push us enough, we will say things like, well, what Adolf Hitler did and what the communist nations did, they were wrong. No, we'd say they're wrong. But we're always arriving at this. And it's who, what, when, where. And then you have the horrendous question that materialists have to face, is that, does it matter given the normal genocide? Does it matter the details that my grandmother took to the grave with her, or my father took to the grave? Now, most of you listening to this, it won't matter at all. You didn't know these people. They're not a part of your family. It's just gone, and who cares? Well, it matters to me. Well, if it matters to me, does it matter? These are enormously difficult questions to grapple with and to answer. And so then we have right and wrong, and we have right for us wins over right for me. Well, why? Because us is stronger, is way stronger than me. So now suddenly we have a collectivist filter that says, well, it has to be right for all of us. And again, this gets into Jordan Peterson and Piaget. Now we say, well, not only via violence, but also because we are riders on elephants, and the elephants are deeply social. Human beings are deeply social animals, and one of the worst things you can do is lock someone up in solitary confinement. I just noticed a trailer for Papillon. I remember reading this book in my youth. I think it was Steve McQueen was in the old movie Papillon, and they're going to re-release it. Well, this is the prison colonies in French Guiana where they mastered solitary, and so much of that book is this individual just trying to keep their sanity, being all by themselves. Well, what does that say about us? Well, we need each other. And in fact, this life, this thing that I call me, which is very much a story, it must be intertwined with other people's stories. And I find meaning intertwined with other people's stories. And I find purpose intertwined with other people's stories. And while we look around our world and we say, oh, life is so much better now because we have antibiotics and we have the internet and we have entertainment and amusements. Well, read Bowling Alone. We're also lonely. Well, why are we lonely? Well, are we lacking people to be with? The world has never been more crowded. Well, why do we push each other away? Well, read the beginning of C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, where hell is a place you can have everything you want. And you go into this dark city and you realize that it's just street after street, house after house, and most of the houses are empty. Why? Because people were building themselves new houses. Well, where were they building themselves new houses? Further out into the suburbs to get away from their neighbors. And so here we are. Our life is a story. We're riders on elephants. We need each other greatly, but we can't stand each other. And we recognize this all the time when it comes to marriage. You stand up and you say, I'll love you to the day I die. And just a handful of years later, you'll think, I'll do anything, even kill myself to get away from this person. This happens all the time. Well, what a strange thing that is. What strange creatures we are. Yet, I don't find a lot of understanding about what we are within the description of this materialist fact universe we're supposed to be living in. So the individual has meaning, agreement, or contrast within the group. Some people derive their meaning by being the enemy of someone. Some people derive their meaning about being within the tribe of someone. And of course, central to a lot of Jordan Peterson's conversations is the tribalism. So history is in many ways story evolution. History is the story of civilizations competing. And it's really more stories competing. Ideas have us. We don't have ideas. Stories have us. And the stories we have are often serving the stories that have us. So what we had in this world was, wars in many ways, or were civilizations of competing stories. Communism wasn't really defeated militarily. Nuclear weapons made that kind of warfare obsolete. And if you don't believe me, that's something that, of course, North Korea figured out a number of years ago. Story war is the way civilizations compete. Okay? And you can see this with, let's say, the Greeks and the Romans. The Romans conquered the Greeks, but the Greeks colonized the Romans. Now, if you go back and you look at my last video about truth, maybe that'll be another example where you can see my point about truth and colonization. Rome conquers Greece. Or did Greece conquer Rome? Well, Roman armies took charge. Roman armies took control. Well, what happened then, let's say, after the fall of the Roman Empire in the transition to the medieval period in Europe? The barbarians came in to conquer Rome, but guess what? What do all those barbarians for centuries call themselves? Well, they're the Holy Roman Empire. Well, what happened? Well, First, Rome tried to conquer Christianity. Roman soldiers crucified Jesus, but eventually Christianity colonized Rome. And then this amalgam of Roman Christianity that came out of the late Roman Empire colonized the barbarians who, with their swords and their horses and their spears, defeated the troops of the de facto Roman Empire, or whoever was pretending to be the empire, whoever was pretending to be the emperor. Now, these weren't genetically Italians, as we would call them today. Again, all these labels get slippery. But again, if you see history, what you begin to see is that which conquers is not necessarily what you would imagine. In other words, stories seem to conquer all of the things that we imagine are actually doing the conquering. And in a sense, we saw this with the Second Iraq War, where could the U.S. roll into Iraq? Sure. And supposedly, what the Bush administration told us is that this invasion was to yield a bright and shining example of democracy in Iraq. Did it? No, not at all. The Sunnis and the Shias continued their war, and so now again we see this large overlay that the end of the Ottoman Empire and the end of the First World War redistributed the Middle East with Jordan and Lebanon, and 1948 you've got Israel and Iraq and Turkey, and but there's the Kurds up there who don't have a homeland. And so history is this amazingly complicated story competition, civilization competition between these stories. And whereas we might say that Western culture continues to dominate, and this in fact was what motivated Al-Qaeda. They originally started attacking American targets because American troops were in Saudi Arabia, and they didn't want the infidels, having their military bases within the Holy Land. But overall, globally, they were also trying to resist, Baywatch and American, what was considered corrupting influences on their culture. This wasn't in that many ways different from, let's say, what the Pharisees in Jesus' day were trying to resist in terms of Greco-Roman influence in their Holy Land. And so, history is the story of these competing stories and all the different clients that these stories have. Now, when you look at it this way, and for example, you look at something that I deal with on a regular basis, which is the story of the Bible, and you begin to read the Old Testament, you begin to understand that, whereas in the ancient Near East, these little tribal nations, and then even scaling up into empires, imagined themselves to be the clients of the gods. Okay, but isn't that just clients of stories? Think about that. So, story war is the way civilizations compete. The storyverse governs everything. At least everything that we know. And competing stories try to outflank each other. So as competing stories try to outflank each other, things get archetypal fast. If you want to prioritize a secular reading, in polytheism, gods were proxies for the civilizations were actually proxies for the gods and their values. But polytheism begets henotheism when some gods conquer other gods, and henotheism begets monotheism. And you say, well, how can you know this? I'd say, this is all written in the book that is in public domain and is the most translated, the most studied book in all of human history. I was doing my class on Ezekiel, and you can find it in my church channel. If you want to sit down and listen to, 30 some episodes of the class, but basically the story of Ezekiel, is the process of the Hebrew prophets, obviously within their religious context, trying to... Part of the difficulty of longer videos is just have more interruptions and then try to keep my train of thought through them. What's interesting, if you look at the world through, let's say, the lens of something like Jared Diamond, where you see, well, human civilization is kind of a one long train, and whereas branches, yes, but they come back and forth into the train. So those who came over the Bering Strait land bridge get isolated in the Americas, and they don't have the animals the animals for domestication. They don't get the diseases. They establish their own civilizations. Jonathan Haidt had a very interesting piece on the skulls of the Aztecs and the massive scale of human sacrifice in the Aztec Empire. And yeah, it's a crazy thing, human history is. And 1493 makes some of the same points. And somehow the world gets stuck back together with Columbus. And so where there's a normal genocide all the time, there's in a sense a one world war that's going on all the time between all of these stories. And story war is perpetual, and it governs life and death. And sometimes we kill each other in fast, obvious ways, but the ultimate always is in play. And again, do we use the word religion for this? There was an interesting article that was written a couple of years ago in Slate, or 1 year ago, I guess, in Slate Star Codex, how the West was won, where Scott Alexander, let's go up to the top, 2 years ago. Oh, is this the article I was looking at? Yeah, I think it was. So a couple of years ago, and he read a post on how traditionalists underestimate the Western civilization. And now this obviously has a lot to do with Jordan Peterson's anxiety about the state of Western civilization, given what's going on. And so he begins to talk about universal culture, because you tend to have this colonization happening. So Rome conquers Greece, but in a sense, Greece conquered Rome. And the barbarians conquered Rome, but in a sense, Roman Christianity conquers the barbarians. So I'll just read some of this. I'm pretty sure there was at one point such a thing as Western civilization. I think it involved things like dancing around maypoles and copying Latin manuscripts. At some point, Thor might have been involved. That civilization is dead. It summoned an empty entity from beyond the void, which devoured its summoner and is proceeding to eat the rest of the world. There might be some Nietzsche behind that. An analogy. Naturopaths like to use the term Western medicine to refer to evidence-based medicine of drugs and surgeries you would get at your local hospital. They contrast this with traditional Chinese medicine or Ayurvedic, I assume that's Indian, medicine, which it has somewhat replaced, apparently a symptom of the westernization of Chinese and Indian societies. But Western medicine is just medicine that works. It happens to be Western because the West had a technological head start, and so discovered most of the medicine that works first. But there's nothing culturally Western about it. There's nothing Christian or Greco-Roman about using penicillin to deal with a bacterial infection. So perhaps points for Sam Harris in lowering the tint of Christianity in anything that happens in the West. The question, of course, then comes around back, but would this have been developed if it had not been for Christianity? So Western medicine replaced the traditional medicine of Europe, Hippocrates' four humors, before it started threatening the traditional medicine of China or India. So-called Western medicine is an inhuman perfect construct from beyond the void summoned by Westerners, which ate traditional Western medicine first and is now proceeding to eat the rest of the world. Western culture is no more related to the geographical West than Western medicine. People who complain about Western culture taking over their country always manage to bring up Coca-Cola. But in what sense is Coca-Cola culturally Western? It's an Ethiopian bean mixed with a Colombian leaf, mixed with carbonated water and lots of sugar. Sugar comes from Indonesia? I don't remember. An American was the first person to discover that this combination tasted really good. Our technological economic head start ensured that. But in a world where America never existed, eventually some Japanese or Arabian chemist would have found that sugar-filled fizzy drinks were really tasty. It was a discovery waiting to be plucked out of the void like penicillin. America summoned it but did not create it. If Western medicine is just medicine that works, soda pop is just refreshment that works. And now I'm reading this, but as I'm reading this, you can probably sense, well, yes and no, yes and no, yes and no as we read through this. Scott Alexander is making his point that there's something deep and built in from the bottom that is giving all of this stuff energy. And you hear that in Brett Weinstein, and you hear that in Jordan Peterson. But there's also something incidental and storified. It was the story of American corporations which were gotten from the Britons, which were gotten from the Dutch. It's these stories that have come through, and it's not just the components of the carbonated water and the sugar and the bit from Ethiopia and the bit from Colombia. It's what brought this together in terms of science, but also in terms of economics, and it's all of these things. And so when we talk about story, it's this almost inconceivably complex thing that's moving through the world. The same is true of more intellectual products. Kaplan notes that foreigners consume Western gender norms. But these certainly aren't gender norms that would have been recognized by Cicero, St. Augustine, Henry VIII, or even Voltaire. They're gender norms that sprung up in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution and its turbulent intermixing of the domestic and public economies. They arose because they worked. We've got pragmatism in there now, too. The West was the first region to colonize and realize that these were gender norms that worked for industrial societies. And as China and Arabia industrialize, they're going to find the same thing. A lot of news accounts this week of women driving in Saudi Arabia. Kaplan writes, a big part of the West's strength, I hasten to add, is its openness to awesomeness. When encounters competing cultures, it gleefully identifies competitors' best traits, then adopts them as its own. Cultural appropriation. By the time Western culture commands the globe, it will have appropriated the best features of Asian and Islamic cultures. Certainly he's pointing at a real phenomenon. Sushi has spread almost as rapidly as Coke, but in what sense has sushi been westernized? Yes, Europe has adopted sushi, but so has China and India and Africa. Sushi is another refreshment that works, a crack in the narrative of what's going on in westernization in any meaningful sense. Here's what I think is going on. Maybe every culture is the gradual accumulation of useful environmental adaptations combined with random mimetic drift. But this is usually a gradual process with plenty of room for everyone to adjust and local peculiarities to seep in. The Industrial Revolution caused such rapid change that the process became qualitatively different, a frantic search for better adaptations to an environment that was itself changing almost as fast as people could understand it. The Industrial Revolution also changed the way culture was spatially distributed. When the fastest mode of transportation was the horse, and the postal system is frequently ambushed by the Huns, almost all culture is local culture. And again, to bring up amusing ourselves to death, Postman again and again goes into the railroad, the telegraph, the photograph, the newspaper, television, radio, television, his day, cable television, and of course, by the internet today. And rapid communication, even at the level of a good postal service, and the equation begins to change. In the 17th century, philosophers were remarking in Latin, the universal language, about how Descartes from French had more in common with Leibniz from Germany than either of them did with the average Frenchman or German. Nowadays, I certainly have more in common with his blog readers in Finland than I do with my next door neighbor whom I've never met. Improved trade and communication networks created a rapid flow of ideas from one big commercial center to another. Things that worked: Western medicine, Coca-Cola, egalitarian gender norms, sushi, spread along the trade networks and started to outcompete things that didn't. It happened in the West first, but not in any kind of black and white way. People were inducted into the universal culture as proportion to their participation in global trade. Shanghai was infected before West Cary. Dubai is further gone than Alabama. The great financial capitals became a single cultural region in the same way that England or France had been a cultural region in the olden times, gradually converging on more and more ideas that worked in their new economic situation. And again, you can see this kind of thing happening in the American political discourse. Let me say again that this is universal culture. In some senses, Scott Alexander here is picking up the baton from Jared Diamond. This is universal culture. Though it started in the West, it was Western only in the most cosmetic ways. If China or the Caliphate had industrialized first, they would have been the ones who developed it, and it would have been much the same. Now we might ask why it was Western Europe that industrialized first. And we're going to get more into these ideas. The new sodas and medicines and gender norms were invented. If the new sodas and medicines and gender norms invented in Beijing or Baghdad would have spread throughout the world, and they would have looked very familiar. The best way to industrialize is the best way to industrialize. And again, that's a simplification for the sake of argument, but this again gets very much into the notion of colonization. And what we might ask Scott Alexander in the process of this is, okay, well, are we starting to find truth? And he goes on. It's well worth reading. And he talks about strong culture and weak culture, and how the combat between these cultures happen, and how this goes around the world. It's well worth reading. Takeaways. Again, back to religion. It's a word that seems to give Sam Harris and Matt Dillahunty rashes. Seems to make them, want to scratch and cough and have fits. Well, you need a common word big enough to talk on this level. Now, you can use culture. Scott Alexander was. Maybe culture works, but culture lacks the aspect. Jordan Peterson really uses religion. Worldview is a word that's been around a while, but it's always a story. And even the experience of Coca-Cola, and what you find in marketing and branding is Coke adds life. I'd like to teach the world to sing. Coke is it. We're a Pepsi generation. I mean, even sugary soft drinks get transformed into stories so that they can have meaning in this. I did a funeral for a friend, and one of the things that his daughter just remembered, he and his daughter used to go to the movies, and he would always buy his daughter this big old cup of soda, and so Coke for her just had this sense. It was into her story. It was into the Western story. It was in a sense into the world. Story is how we experience our lives, and even the things as incidental as a sugary soft drink become incorporated into these stories. It's how to link the moments, not unlike how we link tweets, all to make sense. We had Eric Weinstein talking about the intellectual dark web as an alternative sense-making. Well, what's going on with the intellectual dark web? They are trying to compete with the dominant story. That's everything that Jordan Peterson is doing. And the reason that this picks up resonance and catches fire is that there are elements of it in the broader story war, which is the culture war going on in the West. But our stories are all nested, and our stories compete. Now, Sam Harris's pleasing consciousness doesn't work for anyone. Doesn't work for anyone who matters, and even for Sam Harris. I mean, that's perhaps an oversimplification of what he's trying to say, because of course you can cocaine yourself to death, and Sam Harris suffers in order to make trips to do meaningful things, to debate Jordan Peterson, to write books, to sustain his marriage, to sustain his daughters, to save money for his future. There's nothing particularly fun in most of those things, but he is doing those things. Why? Well, they're part of the story. Now, he'd say, well, it's not religion. Well, it's not far from it. Meaning trumps pleasing consciousness, and I think this is one of the reasons Peterson gets it right, is that meaning, we will sacrifice, we will embrace suffering for the sake of of meaning. And we will eagerly grab meaning with suffering, then live without meaning and pleasure. And we see this worked out in the West right now all the time. And this is part of the reason why Jordan Peterson is having such a big impact on people, saying, I need more meaning in my life, and how this translates into, I need more story in my life. Story is the conveyor for all of this. And again, if there's no story, I don't think you're going to have meaning, and I also don't think you're really going to have right or wrong, because right or wrong almost always implies a telos, a purpose. And so meaning and morality go together easily, and this posture of viewing reality, once we wade in with judgment, we storify it. And competing stories just keep getting larger. Moments beget lifetimes. Lifetimes beget families, clans, and tribes. Tribes beget nations. Nations beget empires and civilizations. Civilizations beget gods. Gods beget God and eternity. God begets science. And is Nietzsche right that Western civilization kills God? Nature begets supernature. The problem that Peterson often points out, and that one of my friends watching this said Peterson didn't make the point clear enough in Vancouver, was that when people become more rational, it doesn't mean they get less storified. In fact, the only way to understand the energy and determination and passion, as C.S. Lewis says in Miracles, that these men enter the fray for their tribe, for their atheist tribe, is story. And so when they enter the fray, they enter the story. And so it's really hard to say, well, I don't think story is very important. Well, then why are you spending your time suffering? Well, because I enjoy it. Well, why do you enjoy it? Because you find it meaningful. Well, there's no meaning without story. We have to be honest about our storied nature. If you don't like some words, you can pick others. Philosophy have been doing this the whole time. It's the nature of the evolution of language, but story lurks behind everything, named or unnamed. The percentage of the population, however, that prefers abstractions, that will watch my videos or pay good money to watch Jordan Peterson, and can manage abstractions, is a minority. And this might indulge some of us in pride and to elitism, but be careful, because there isn't any demonstration that this level of abstraction will necessarily, in a Darwinian sense, improve the prospect of your tribe. abstractions keep getting storified. You almost can't write about a book with abstractions without turning it into stories for even your other abstraction-loving people to understand. Watch the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris fandoms talk about who won. Well, winning is about this. The bulk of the herd will continue to major in stories. They will watch Lord of the Rings. They will watch Star Wars unless Star Wars continues to kill themselves. There's a perpetual struggle between individuals and the herd. These things continue. I just, in fact, saw Solo last night with my wife, and generally enjoyed the movie. It was fun to watch the thing. But there again at the end comes this storyline. It's like, oh, all the reasons Christian movies are so often so bad. Star Wars is following the evangelical Christian movie script, and they're going to do it to their own destruction, it appears. We have these oppressed, enslaved victims who use power to rise up and take what they demand, take what is owed them, take what they deserve. And you don't start into this very deeply, and already you're knocking at the door of this objective standard. But this objective standard you cannot appropriate without it being appropriated into story. And this is exactly the difficulty that Sam Harris and the materialists have in terms of, as Thomas Nagel keeps saying, incorporating the mind into the material world, into the physical layer, as I would call it. And this is publicly, in a way that is publicly knowable. So, okay, you've got these young and oppressed slave. Are they oppressed? Peterson says it again. I'm oppressed. You're oppressed. Everyone's oppressed throughout history. If you cannot help but find ways you have been oppressed. In fact, your mind is linked to being very sensitive to this. And if you feel slighted, even in a relationship, you will feel it, and you will object, and you will feel wronged. Not subjectively wronged, but publicly wronged and objectively wronged. And again, this is why I have doubts about materialists, because they seem to feel themselves wronged as much as any storified religion person does. It's publicly knowable. They're looking for a way that's publicly knowable and that's obtainable. But how are these young, oppressed people going to, in fact, make the world right? Well, listen to The Who. We won't get fooled again. If you're too young to know this song, look it up on YouTube and listen to it with the lyrics. It's the story of humanity. So then what is religion? It's just the stories with the supernatural, and in some ways, practically. Now, I'm taking this from below, as you might have gathered. I'm pulling all of my Christian, maybe not all of my Christian punches, but I'm pulling a lot of my Christian punches. Religion, in many ways, is a Ulysses contract. It's Odysseus, and I got it wrong the first time I made this illustration in a video. It's Odysseus telling his compadres, strap me to the mast because I want to hear the sirens. But all of you are going to have your ears plugged. In a sense, because we live in the moment, because we are such bad judges, because we need each other, in fact, in order to make judgment, what religion does is give our ancestors a say in our decision-making process. Now, you might say, well, I don't need religion to do that. I can read history and I can read philosophy, and I would recommend that you do these things. But religion tends to do it in a more disciplined way, and these are exactly the ways that Sam Harris is objecting to in his complaints of dogma. And I've made the point before in other videos that his realization of dogma, I don't think, is exactly how it plays out, because Delahanty says religions don't change. And I think, if you visit a church in 2018 in North America and you go into a time machine and you visit a church in medieval Europe, and then you visit a church in, let's say, the Acts 2 church in Jerusalem, you are going to have three very different experiences. And you will notice that religion is changing all along. Well, how is it changing? Well, it's always updating. Well, you might say, but there's drags. And yeah, that's exactly right. You have the same economy. You tend to have people who are temperamentally open. You have people who are temperamentally conservative, and they're having conversations. But what they are doing is having conversations within in a sense, a controlled environment. And if you look at my Sola Scriptura video, how the Bible functions is hopefully keeping things together and keeping people more or less on the same page. I had 2 emails this weekend from a couple of the people who I've been having ongoing conversations with since I've been doing these videos that had bumped into, one joined a religious chat group and another one was thinking about church, and they begin to realize, oh my goodness, these churches are these isolated little communities that have so little connection to the bigger outside world. Well, yes and no. Different churches have different connections to the outside world, and part of the religion is modulating those kinds of connections. So, for example, Orthodox are very buffered, Roman Catholic perhaps a little less buffered, and Protestants are ready to change everything, because they've always got their nascent insecurities about keeping up with the world, partly because they've got their post-millennial mindset, at least some of them, and the Democratic Party just seems to be evolving according to the kingdom of heaven, faster than the church can. And so if you read mainline liberal blogs, they're always complaining about how behind their mainline liberal church is compared to the world. And a lot of people apparently have been reading their mail and agreed with them, and so given up on church and just joined the Pepsi movement. I got everybody wanting to say something to me. My wife's on vacation now because she's a school teacher, and it makes it hard to get work done during the day because the kids all go off to work. Well, then it's, where are you when I need to talk to you? Well, I'm at work. So what is wisdom? Transcend your individual moment without losing your individual self. And we always do this in our minds. We have consciousness, but then we have this self that kind of sets apart from consciousness. And Sam Harris talked about this in terms of his consciousness. Now I'm having trouble focusing because my wife has just decided to text my phone like crazy. Transcend your tribal moment without losing your community identity, without making your elephant too nervous. And again, this isn't necessarily religion as such. A lot of people try to do this without religion. That's called secularity. Now, is this process itself religion? Well, you can argue about the word if you want, but it's the same process. How to prioritize the best data when your ability to discern is compromised. And again, Peterson talked about this in the Oxford video in terms of the American system of government, where the founding fathers set things up in a way that they assumed the United States wasn't always going to have the kind of presidents that the founding fathers would hope that they would have. And so what you want to do is build into your system things against you. And now people do this all the time, and I bet you Sam Harris does. I bet you Sam Harris tries to eat right and exercise, and he has his disciplines of meditation, and he wants to read history, and he wants to read philosophy. He's doing all of these things, and now he'll say, well, these aren't religion because I'm keeping myself clean from these supernatural. And I think, oh, okay, but you're also just kind of not availing yourself of any wisdom that might be there. And he might say, well, there's no wisdom there. I'd say, well, how do you know? This is, in a sense, kind of the complaint you have against Christian people that live behind their church walls and never go out from it. And that those kinds of decisions are always hard to make. If you're an alcoholic, do you go down the wine aisle in the supermarket? If you're a married person, do you hang out with your old girlfriends? If you're struggling with drugs, do you, when you get clean, need to make all new friends? I mean, it's all these kinds of decisions that we make about, well, what do I know about myself? I know that I am not always 100% in control of myself. So therefore, I will make decisions about my life. I will cut off some of my freedoms in order to have the life that I want. Well, there's your Ulysses contract. Well, talk to anybody trying to get sober and they'll say, it's a lot easier if I do this with a group, because if I'm my own judge, I'm going to undercut myself. And we see each other with a little bit more objectivity than we see ourselves, especially if we can focus on something that's, let's say, sobriety. So together I can do this. And okay, so now we're including all of these things. And so basically what you're trying to do is what the humanists have been trying to do and say, well, we're going to have church without God, but it never seems to do very well. Well, that's because we haven't tried. Well, now you're sounding like the communists. We even need to critique the winners. And again, this was a terrific thing, and we've got this terrific article, and we've got this idea of universal culture, and in a sense, truth is that which colonizes. And so the truer culture we imagine on a big scale, on a long time scale, wins. But here's the problem. We only live, 50, 80, 100 years. And especially if you're a materialist, this is your only life now. And you spent the first 20 years just trying to learn something. You spent the next 10 years, well, probably trying to figure out relationships and stuff and get into a career. Then you spend the next 30 years trying to build a career, and then you're too old. Well, now I can understand Sam Harris saying, well, I want my best conscious life now because life is short and I've got to get it all in. But now you begin to understand the complexities of the issue, because you're embedded within all of these stories, and your life itself is a story, and you can't even trust yourself. And if you think you can trust yourself, live long enough and you'll probably learn you can't. Well, now I'm starting to sound like Jordan Peterson. So we need to critique the assassin robot. Well, how do we critique the assassin robot? Well, we need each other. And our stories critique the assassin robot. And now Brett Weinstein wants to say, yeah, but we've got to critique these stories. On what basis do you critique these stories? Well, how's that going to go? Well, I can talk to people around me. Well, and this is where Jordan Peterson comes in, and in a sense Brett Weinstein too, when he talks about evolution and marriage. It's really helpful if we can magnify the amount of test cases by looking back in time and reading history. Now, every one of those people was contextualized, so whenever you read history, you begin to discover, oh my goodness, there's so much I have to learn, even if I just want to follow this one thread. Yeah. And we thought we knew everything when we were 15 years old, and the nice sociologist came and asked us, is it right? Who should you have sex with? And you just make up an answer because of everything that your watchers have filtered, and there you are. And then by the time you become 50 or 60, 70, you might have a little bit more wisdom. But then pretty soon all that wisdom is going to die. And you're going to take it with you. And just the little sliver that you leave, if anybody has ever paid attention, besides your immediate family, most of whom will forget you and die within a couple of generations, well, gets nihilistic fast. In a sense, what you need to do is dethrone yourself. And a lot of you out there who've been practicing meditation and working on Buddhism, well, this is familiar language. You need to dethrone yourself. It's not unfamiliar language to Christians either. Christians have a real issue with themselves. Well, can you really do this by playing what if? Well, I don't know. Well, what if God exists? I don't know. As long as I'm saying what if God exists, I'm not really giving myself to it fully, am I? I'm still sort of playing a pragmatic game. But what really is deep at the basement of my heart saying why I want to do this? Because it's constructed. Tim Keller has this very interesting thing on divine election that some of you have been asking. Well, what about Calvinism? What about election? I like Tim Keller's answer. He said, any decision I make leads to a world of unforeseen consequences. And so if I didn't believe that God was loving and sovereign, I could dare get out of bed in the morning. But if I'm playing as if with my free will, I've got free will, and I don't really believe I have free will, then why get out of bed in the morning? Oh, you get out of bed because you're programmed to get out of the bed. Oh, thanks. But what do I do with this little sense of self that I have, consciousness? Well, you can meditate and get rid of it. Okay, but why am I playing this game at all? Because I believe what I am is a story, and I want my story to matter, and I want my story to be interesting, and I'm always trying to modulate between having a pleasant experience of conscious right now and having a meaningful story right now. And often these things are in competition with each other, and if I want to have a meaningful story, I'm going to have to embrace suffering. This is Jordan Peterson's pick up your heavy cross and pull it up a hill. But what if there's nothing on the top of the hill? And so one of the individuals, so some of the people watching my videos, when they go to the Jordan Peterson events, they write back to me, and one of the persons who went to the event basically asked him, okay, and his question got selected, and said, okay, well, what if there's nothing at the top of the hill that you're dragging your heavy cross up? Is there something up there? And that's when Jordan Peterson gives his resurrection answer and says, I'd have to think 3 years before I would know what's up there. And it's like, okay, then you're really still playing this as if game. If you really want to play it well, who wins the gold medal in the Olympics? The guy who is training as if he's going to the Olympics, or the person who knows, believes they're going to the Olympics? Well, believing in that sense means something. It means something motivationally. It means something at great depths of your soul, that as if I'm going to the Olympics, there are days when, well, I'm training as if I'm going to the Olympics, but boy, that Ben & Jerry's ice cream really looks good. Well, if you're really going to the Olympics, you train in a different way. If this is the only game, Mao, Stalin, and Hitler got away with it. And maybe you will too. And will you be able to divorce that from the back of your mind? Or will in some way, and again, watch my Sunday school class from this past week. Did Lee Harvey Oswald get away with it? Well, it depends how you figure about Jack Ruby shooting him. But, what is getting away with it? What is justice? Can justice be done? How on earth would Mao be called to account for the millions dead, or Stalin or Hitler? Adam Smith, a lot of people look at Adam Smith and say, well, that was economics. Well, what Adam Smith really worked on was moral philosophy. And Adam Smith essentially said it's the hope of trading for another day that keeps you from cheating now. See, we look at capitalism with moral scruples now, but Adam Smith basically was saying capitalism makes people honest. Why? Because they want to get wealthy. Well, what do you have to do to get wealthy? Why? Well, you have to develop virtues. And so you want to keep trading honestly so people will keep trading with you another day. Now you've got Piaget and Panksepp's rats. We want to play another day. We want the equilibrated game. And so, well, what happens if this is the only game? Well, then you're tempted to think in other ways. You say, well, even though I really believe it's the only game, I'm going to live as if it isn't. And I know Peterson keeps saying, well, belief, but really believe, if I really believe that Jordan Peterson is going to come this Wednesday night, if I really believe my wife may or may not agree to come because she's like, I don't know if I want to sit and listen to this guy. He's generally disposed to him, but, doesn't know much about him. And I said, well, we'll go to the VIP thing. Well, I don't want all kinds of people coming up to me and meeting me. And my wife's a pretty private person. So, live as if. Well, I believe, Lord willing, Christian phrase, I believe Jordan Peterson is going to be in Sacramento Wednesday night, and I believe I'm going to be in that theater, and I believe I'm going to meet some other people in Sacramento who are Peterson fans, and I believe it's going to be a good time. I believe I'm going to go on vacation this summer. I believe a lot of things. Well, this belief is important. I'm going to live as if I'm going to see Jordan Peterson Wednesday night. Well, even that little as if brings me off it. Well, then you might say, well, how can you believe this stuff about the resurrection and about Jesus? Well, we've already talked about it. My story is embedded in all of these other stories. And just like the alcoholic that wants to believe there is a higher power that can deliver him from his alcoholism and so keeps going to groups. Well, I want to believe in the resurrection, so I keep going to my group. Well, what is my group? My group is the church. It's not hard to understand how this stuff works psychologically. Well, how do you know you're right? Well, we've all got that problem. If this is the only game, Miroslav Volf, I've made this point in other videos too, kill the evildoers here and now because this is the only judgment that can come. But if you're trying to get heaven by bringing justice, you'll drag up hell as well. And that's what the civil war in the Balkans that Miroslav Volf lived through. This was his observation, that people who no longer believed in an afterlife wouldn't even live as if there was an afterlife. Well, you know, we've got to bring judgment upon our enemies, and so we're going to use any means necessary to make their lives miserable and kill them because they've hurt me. Well, isn't this implicit in all of these, you know, little Star Wars people who are rising up to get their weapons to take down the Empire? Well, the Who. Meet the new boss. Same as the old boss. Round and round we go. If you listen to my sermons, this is a big theme in my sermons in terms of what Jesus does. Jesus interrupts that process of revolution and says, I'm not just going to be another revolutionary. I am going to undermine revolution by doing the unthinkable. I'm not going to be a suicide bomber that goes into Herod's palace and blows himself up. I am going to become Herod's victim, and I am going to not just offer the sacrifice, I am going to be the sacrifice. And then, of course, the resurrection comes around. And if you lose the resurrection, this crucifixion really doesn't make a lot of sense. So reason and rationalization. Post hoc reasoning looks bad. None of us want to believe this is post hoc reasoning. Well, pastor, you're just saying these things because you're a pastor. Pastor, you're saying these things because your parents raised you this way. Pastor, you're saying these things because people on Patreon are giving you money to say these things. Pastor, you're saying these things because the church pays you to say these things. Is there an element of truth to that? Probably. We're mixed bags. But there's an element of truth to all of our tribalisms and all of these beliefs and all of the ways we are working through stories. We've got reasons to believe this is an illusion. Well, what do I mean this is an illusion? That reason is an illusion. I mean, part of the most interesting thing to me about the Sam Harris and Dillahunty, which is exactly why C.S. Lewis wrote Miracles in the way he did, was they keep appealing to reason, but if we are completely constructed, all of my experience of reason has to be an illusion. It's no different from my experience of being hungry or my experience of itching or my experience of my shoulder hurting. It's all just experience. Well, why do we prioritize it with reason? Well, we say we do because we can see that it works. Well, how do we know that it works? And this is where you get into Dillahunty and Slick again. You're using the same mind to evaluate. And so you keep having this problem in that. Unless, of course, reason is something that actually colonizes nature and isn't simply the product of nature. And that essentially is their argument. Well, we know there's something to reason because via reason we can colonize nature. We can make the atomic bomb. We can build the civilization. We can build the internet. There must be something true of reason. Well, where is that coming from? And why is it there? And what has the power of colonization? Well, truth. Okay, well, again, go back to my last video on what is truth. We suspect it to be true of others, but we disagree with it. Oh, Sam Harris is not going to give an inch when he meets with Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson is not going to give an inch when he meets with Sam Harris. And this is why we tend to value people that feel honest to us. Well, what are our metrics of feeling honest? Well, it's by the tone of their voice. It's by how sincere they look. Then again, there are celebrities in our culture are actors who are paid to misrepresent, to represent other people's stories. And what do we have? Well, hand-wringing for 100 years. You know, when is religion going to give up the ghost? It ain't. In fact, the degree to which you can help people clarify their systems, it's the fuzzy that suffer. It's not the religious. It's not even the atheists. Why? See, I would argue atheists are religious too. Now, of course, Sam Harris says atheism is nothing. Yeah, you're doing a lot of argument for nothing. The story is here to stay. And this is why, so watched a video from Amy Kay. She had a couple of video commentaries, and after seeing the Vancouver event, and she's a Sam Harris fangirl, and she loves Sam Harris. And if I was Sam Harris's wife, I'd probably wouldn't be so happy about Amy Kay getting too close to Sam Harris. So maybe Sam Harris's wife is a very secure woman. Jordan Peterson's wife travels with Jordan Peterson. They've managed to stay married for 30 years, probably because they have all of these agreements, and their love is built within a storied context. Story is here to stay. Part of the reason I don't buy the Harris Dillahunty frame of life, well, maybe it's because I've been constructed this way, but because I just find story too absolutely powerful and pervasive. And even if Sam Harris is right, his way loses, because as long as we have human beings, they're going to have stories. And I think Jordan Peterson is dead on right here. If you take people's religious stories away, they fill it in with new stories. I was in a hospital waiting room once with a family, and a member of that family was dying. Sometimes, as a pastor, you get to be around dying people. And this individual was dying in the hospital in a way that was very hard to watch. His body wasn't giving up, and there was just spasms, and terribly emotionally difficult for his wife to watch. Actually, this was his estranged wife, and I remember being in the waiting room, and his estranged wife and her brother embraced, and they began to sing a song, and it was a Kenny Rogers song, and it was nostalgic and sappy and really a silly little song. But for these two, well, the Freedom from Religion people would say they find meaning and wonder in a Kenny Rogers song. Good for them. But that's the point. This is how we are made. We are tribal, as Brett Weinstein says, and I think we are religious to the core. And I think the real difficulty you have if you're going to maintain this atheist position, not that I can understand if you say, well, I can't believe in a God. Okay, I understand that. The difficulty is that you would imagine that somehow you will not be what we would call religious. Okay, if the word gives you hives, have a worldview, have a philosophy of life. But what you will not be divorced from is the power of story, and the power of stories that have been going all the way back in time. Now, was it only Judeo-Christian stories? No. But Judeo-Christian stories have had this power that we've seen again and again in human history of them triumphing over. And now the story warfare is going right now. And there's as Scott Alexander calls the universal story. And then there's, Christian stories and Islamic stories and well, wasn't it recently that Iceland, they have a new temple to their Norse gods, and what you'll probably hear is, well, we're getting rid of the Christian gods, okay, and we're really atheists deep down, okay, but we're going to have this Norse temple, and it's like, track record, look behind us. What do we do as human beings? We do what we've always done. Well, I'm going to do differently. Yeah, little 80-year-old self that has been developed through all of this time. If you're a materialist, you can't help but recognize all of the layers of construction, and story is built into everyone. So looks like an hour and 45 minutes. Don't know if it was my best video or not. Just a couple little end notes. So yeah, today is Monday. I'll post this later today. Jordan Peterson is coming to Sacramento on Wednesday, so I will be there. If my wife decides to go, she'll be there with me. Otherwise, I'll find someone else to go with me. And I'm going to the VIP event, so we'll probably have 30 seconds to shake Jordan's hand and get a picture. So I'll get my picture with him, and I'll probably post that in a video. Why not? But what'll be more fun about the VIP event will actually probably be meeting others of you who go to the VIP event, and or meet before or after. Our Jordan Peterson meetup is the next night. And so, yeah, if you're around tomorrow or around Wednesday night in Sacramento, love to meet you.